The year is 1835. Deep in the American wilderness, two armies are marching. They aren't fighting redcoats. They aren't fighting a foreign invader. They are fighting each other. On one side, the militia of Ohio. On the other, the militia of Michigan. Thousands of men are mobilized. Bayonets are fixed. Cannons are rolled into position. Governors are screaming for blood. The President of the United States is panicking in the White House, watching his own states teeter on the edge of a full-scale civil war. Decades before the actual Civil War, the prize, a narrow 468-square-mile strip of swampy land. The tension is thick. The stakes are high. But as the smoke clears and the dust settles, the history books record a casualty list that sounds like a punchline. No one was killed in battle. No cities were burned. In the end, only one man was wounded, and it wasn't even by a bullet. This is the story of the Toledo War, the most intense, aggressive, and ultimately ridiculous border dispute in American history. To understand why two states were willing to kill each other over a swamp, you have to understand the map of the early 19th century. In the 1830s, the United States was still growing. Ohio was already a state, a powerful one with votes in Congress. Michigan, however, was still a territory. It was the little brother looking for a seat at the table. And in the middle of their border sat the Toledo Strip. At the time, land wasn't just space, it was survival. But the Toledo Strip had something more valuable than gold: the mouth of the Maumee River. In an era before highways, water was everything. The Maumee River was the key to the proposed Miami and Erie Canal. Whoever controlled Toledo controlled the trade of the entire Great Lakes region. Whoever controlled the port controlled the future wealth of the Midwest. For Ohio, losing Toledo meant losing a commercial empire. For Michigan, giving it up meant being bullied by its neighbor before it even became a state. It wasn't just about dirt. It was about pride, sovereignty, and millions of dollars in future tax revenue. And neither side was willing to blink. So how did this happen? How do two states end up with overlapping borders? It all started with a bad map from 1787. When the Northwest Ordinance was written to organize the Great Lakes region, they used the Mitchell map. The problem? The Mitchell map was wrong. It showed Lake Michigan much further north than it actually was. The law stated the border should be an east-west line drawn through the southerly bend or extreme of Lake Michigan. If you use the old, incorrect map, that line put Toledo in Ohio. But if you used a real, geographically accurate survey, that line shifted north, placing Toledo firmly inside Michigan. For decades, nobody cared because the area was mostly the Great Black Swamp, a mosquito-infested nightmare that no one wanted to live in. But by the 1830s, the swamp was being drained. The canal was coming. Suddenly, that useless strip of land was the most valuable real estate in the West. Ohio claimed the Harris Line. Michigan claimed the Fulton Line. Between those two lines sat 468 square miles of disputed territory. And in 1835, the dispute turned from a legal argument into a military standoff. The conflict escalated because of two very stubborn men. On the Michigan side, you had Stevens T. Mason. He was only 23 years old, earning him the nickname the Boy Governor. He was hot-headed, ambitious, and obsessed with Michigan's rights. On the Ohio side, you had Governor Robert Lucas. He was a seasoned politician, a veteran of the War of 1812, and he had the backing of the president. In early 1835, Ohio passed a law extending its jurisdiction over the Strip. They appointed judges. They set up a local government. Mason's response? He passed the Pains and Penalties Act. This law made it a criminal offense for any Ohioan to exercise official jurisdiction in the Toledo Strip. If an Ohio official tried to collect taxes or hold court in Toledo, Michigan would throw them in jail. Mason didn't just talk. He acted. He mobilized the Michigan militia and marched them into Toledo. Governor Lucas wasn't about to be intimidated by a boy. He raised his own army of 600 Ohio militiamen and marched them to the border. The two armies were now facing each other across the Maumee River. War was no longer a metaphor. It was a physical reality. But before we get to the battlefield and the lone casualty of this war, a quick note about how I set the mood for these stories. The tension of a midnight border raid or the atmosphere of a 19th century wilderness requires the right sound. That's why I use epidemic sound. Whether I need a sweeping orchestral score for a moment of historical importance, or just the subtle sound of boots crunching on dry leaves and the chirping of swamp crickets, they have it all. If you're a creator, you know that bad audio ruins a good story. With epidemic sound, you get unlimited access to a massive library of high-quality tracks and SFX, all cleared for use on YouTube, so you never have to worry about copyright strikes. Check out the link in the description to start your free trial and level up your storytelling. Now, back to the edge of the swamp. By April 1835, the Toledo War was in full swing. An Ohio survey team was out marking the border when they were intercepted by a Michigan posse. The Michiganders arrived with guns drawn, shouting for the surveyors to surrender. The Ohioans did what any sensible person would do when confronted by an armed mob in a swamp. They ran. The Michigan militia fired shots into the air, some say over the heads of the retreating surveyors, and managed to capture 9 of them. Back in Ohio, Governor Lucas was furious. He claimed his men had been fired upon by bloodthirsty invaders. He called for more troops. The newspapers on both sides began printing propaganda, calling the other side barbarians and thieves. President Andrew Jackson was losing his mind. He was in a political bind. He needed Ohio's votes for the upcoming election, but Michigan was technically in the right, based on the legal maps. He sent commissioners to negotiate, but the boy Governor Mason wouldn't listen. He wanted Toledo, and he wanted statehood, and he wasn't giving up either. As the summer heat rose, the war became a series of kidnappings and late-night raids. Michigan authorities would sneak into Toledo, grab an Ohio official, and drag them back to a jail in Monroe, Michigan. Ohioans would retaliate by harassing Michigan supporters. But then, on July 15, 1835, the only blood of the war was finally spilled. It didn't happen in a grand charge. It happened in a tavern. A Michigan sheriff named Joseph Wood went to arrest a man named Two Stickney. Yes, his real name was Two. His brother's name was One. Their father, Benjamin Stickney, was an eccentric who didn't want to give his kids ordinary names. Two Stickney wasn't going quietly. When Sheriff Wood tried to take him into custody, Two pulled out a small penknife. He stabbed the sheriff in the side. The wound wasn't fatal. It was barely a puncture, but it was the shot heard round the swamp. Sheriff Wood survived, but the incident gave President Jackson the excuse he needed. He fired the boy governor, Stevens T. Mason, replacing him with a more compliant official. The war was effectively over, but the legal battle was just beginning. By 1836, the U.S. government came up with a solution that seemed like a loss for Michigan at the time. The deal was this: Ohio gets the Toledo Strip. In exchange, Michigan gets to become a state, but only if it accepts a different piece of land as a consolation prize. That land, the Upper Peninsula. At the time, the people of Michigan were insulted. The Upper Peninsula, the UP, was seen as a frozen, barren wasteland. One Michigan newspaper called it a sterile region of eternal snows. They didn't want it. They wanted the port of Toledo. But they were broke and desperate for statehood, so they eventually agreed to the trade. On January 26, 1837, Michigan officially became the 26th state. Ohio kept Toledo. Michigan kept the wilderness to the north. Looking back from today, the Toledo War is one of the funniest episodes in American history. 2 states nearly killed each other over a river mouth. But history has a weird way of deciding winners. Ohio got Toledo. For a few decades it was a booming canal town. But then something happened in the sterile wasteland of the Upper Peninsula. Explorers found copper. Then they found iron. Massive, world-changing amounts of it. The mineral wealth pulled from the Upper Peninsula ended up being worth hundreds of times more than the Toledo Strip ever was. It fueled the American Industrial Revolution. Today, Michigan is famous for the Great Lakes and the rugged beauty of the UP. Ohio, well, they have Toledo. And according to most Michigan football fans, they're welcome to it. The Toledo War reminds us that what we think is a victory today might look very different 100 years later. It was a war fought with pride, settled with a penknife, and won by the side that thought they had lost. And all it cost was one very sore sheriff.